Have you ever stayed in a hotel that made you feel unsafe? Not because of the neighborhood, not because of the locks on the door, but because you felt like someone or something was there with you, watching you, even though the hallways looked empty. Daniel was 27 at the time. He worked as a traveling salesman, and in 2014, he was bouncing between small towns across the Midwest, moving from hotel to hotel. After 2 weeks of nonstop driving, late-night check-ins, and fast food dinners, he was burned out. He pulled into Springfield, Missouri, late one night and checked into a budget hotel just off the interstate. It was one of those 3-story chain hotels with neon lights buzzing outside and carpet that smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarettes. The place wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, and more than anything, Daniel just wanted a bed and a few hours of sleep. The man at the front desk gave him a keycard for room 312. Daniel dragged his suitcase down the long, quiet hallway, noticing how the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum louder than usual. A few of them flickered, and the sound of his shoes against the carpet seemed unnaturally loud. When he got inside, the room was ordinary. Beige wallpaper, a queen bed, a dresser with a TV bolted to the top. He dropped his bag, loosened his tie, and collapsed onto the bed, barely bothering to kick off his shoes. For the first time all day, he let out a deep breath. But not long after closing his eyes, something woke him. It wasn't a loud noise, just 3 slow, deliberate knocks on his door. Daniel sat up, disoriented, and checked the clock. It was 11:17 p.m. Who would be at his door this late? He called out, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Yeah? Who is it?" No response. Cautiously, he walked to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The carpet stretched out in both directions and every door was shut. There was nobody there. After a minute of hesitation, he stepped back, shook his head and muttered, "Probably some kids messing around." But it happened again. 20 minutes later, 3 harder knocks echoed through the room. This time, his pulse quickened. He got up, heart pounding, and looked through the peephole again. Nothing. He waited, his eye pressed to the glass, hoping to catch someone running away, but the hallway was perfectly still. This time, he opened the door a crack. The fluorescent light above his door buzzed and flickered, and for a moment Daniel thought maybe that was all it was, just his nerves, the exhaustion catching up to him. But then he saw him. At the far end of the hallway near the stairwell stood a man, tall, thin, dressed in a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. He wasn't walking, he wasn't moving, he was just standing there, facing Daniel's direction. Can I help you?" Daniel called out nervously. His voice echoed down the hall. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. Daniel quickly shut the door and locked it, sliding the chain across. He sat on the bed, trying to calm his breathing, telling himself it was just another guest, maybe someone waiting for a friend. But then came the scratching. Soft at first, then more deliberate, fingernails dragging across his door. The sound was enough to make his stomach drop. Daniel froze. His eyes flicked to the crack at the bottom of the door, and that's when he saw it. A shadow. Someone's feet shifting back and forth right outside his room. Panicked, he grabbed the room's phone and dialed the front desk. But the line was dead. Just a faint buzzing static. He pulled out his cell phone and tried calling, but no one picked up. He tried again. Still no answer. The scratching grew louder. Whoever was outside his room wasn't leaving. Daniel backed up toward the bed, staring at the door, every muscle in his body tense. Minutes dragged by like hours. He could hear movement, the faint sound of someone breathing just inches away from him, separated only by that thin door. Then suddenly, silence. Daniel sat frozen, waiting, listening to the hum of the lights outside, the faint tick of the air conditioner. He waited a full 10 minutes before moving. Grabbing his bag, he made up his mind. He was leaving. He slowly unlatched the chain and turned the handle. The hallway stretched out in eerie silence. The man was gone. Not a sound, not a shadow in sight. Daniel stepped out, heart hammering in his chest, and hurried down the hall, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he burst into the lobby, the night clerk looked up, startled. Daniel rushed to the desk, stammering out what had happened, someone knocking on his door, scratching, standing at the end of the hallway. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, just shook his head slowly. "You're not the first guest to say that," he said in a low voice. Daniel blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The clerk leaned closer. "We've had people complain about the same thing, a tall man in a hoodie standing in the halls at night, knocking on doors, but the thing is," he hesitated, head glancing around the lobby, We have cameras, every hallway, every floor, and whenever we check the footage after a complaint, you know what we see? Daniel didn't answer. Nothing, the clerk whispered. The hallways are empty. Always empty. Daniel left that hotel that very night, driving an hour out of town before finally finding another place to stay. He never asked for a refund, never filed a complaint. To this day, he swears he saw someone standing at the end of that hallway scratching at his door. But the fact that the cameras showed nothing, that's what haunts him the most. And if you've ever stayed in a hotel room alone at the end of a long hallway, you might wonder the same thing Daniel does. When you close your door and drift off to sleep, is the hallway really empty, Lee? Mark was 34 when this happened. He was in Chicago for a conference, staying at a large downtown hotel with nearly 30 floors. The kind of place with polished marble in the lobby, chandeliers, and bellhops in tidy uniforms. It wasn't a cheap motel or some rundown roadside inn. This was supposed to be a classy, safe place. His conference wrapped up late, and after a couple of drinks with coworkers, he returned to the hotel a little after 1 a.m. The lobby was quiet except for the night staff. Mark pressed the button for the elevator and waited, scrolling through his phone. The doors opened with a ding and he stepped inside. The mirrored walls reflected his tired face back at him, the dim lights buzzing overhead. He pressed the button for the 18th floor, leaned against the railing and sighed. As the doors slid shut, he noticed something. There was a woman standing in the far corner. He swore she hadn't been there when he stepped inside, but maybe he was distracted with his phone. She was dressed in a pale gray dress, her long black hair falling over her shoulders. She didn't look at him, didn't move, just stood there with her head tilted slightly down. Mark felt a prickle of unease. He gave a polite nod and muttered, "Evening." No response. The elevator began to rise. The silence between them was heavy. Mark glanced at the numbers above the door as they ticked upward. 4, 5, 6. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he looked at her reflection in the mirror, it seemed like she was standing a little closer. But when he turned his head, she hadn't moved. By the time they hit the 10th floor, Mark's nerves were buzzing. He kept his eyes fixed on the door, telling himself he was just imagining it. But then the elevator jerked. It shuddered violently, lights flickering, and came to a dead stop between the 12th and 13th floors. Mark cursed under his breath, pressing the alarm button. Nothing. He pressed it again. Still nothing. He reached for his phone, but before he could dial, he heard something. A whisper. It came from the woman. He turned his head slowly. Her face was still angled downward, her hair hiding most of her features, but her lips were moving. She was whispering something too faint for him to understand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice unsteady. She stopped whispering. The silence was unbearable. Mark gripped his phone tighter, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then suddenly, she snapped her head up. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, and her mouth stretched into a grin that seemed far too big. Mark staggered back, pressing against the elevator wall. The woman let out a low, guttural laugh, one that didn't sound human. The lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, she was gone. The elevator was empty. Mark was alone. The lights steadied, and the elevator lurched back to life, climbing smoothly again as if nothing had happened. By the time the doors opened on the 18th floor, he was shaking. He stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, his heart racing. The next morning, he went down to the front desk to check out early. He couldn't stay another night. The clerk, seeing how pale he looked, asked if everything was okay. Mark hesitated, then asked a simple question. "Do your elevators ever act up?" The clerk frowned. "Not that I know of. Why do you ask?" Mark swallowed hard, then whispered, "I wasn't alone in there last night." The clerk gave him a strange look, but before he could explain further, another employee walked by and overheard. She froze, her eyes darting toward him. "Was it a woman?" she asked quietly. Mark's blood ran cold. The clerk looked confused. "What are you talking about?" The employee leaned closer. "You're not the first one. Some guests? They've said they saw her too. A woman in gray, always in the elevator late at night. She doesn't ride it with anyone. She just appears." Mark didn't say another word. He grabbed his bag, walked out of the lobby, and never looked back. He told me that even now, years later, he avoids elevators whenever he can. He takes the stairs no matter how many floors. Because the thought of being trapped again, alone with her, that's something he can't risk. Hotels are supposed to be safe. Elevators are supposed to be routine. But for Mark Collins, that short ride to the 18th floor turned into the longest, most terrifying minutes of his life. And if you're ever in a hotel elevator late at night and someone else steps in, you might want to look twice. Chris was on a business trip in San Antonio in 2017. His company had put him up in a hotel not far from the Riverwalk. Modern, clean, nothing unusual. He checked into room 409, unpacked his things, and settled in for the night. The walls were thin enough that he could faintly hear the TV from the room next door. He didn't mind. It made him feel less alone. But around 1 a.m., Chris was woken by a sound that wasn't a television. It was knocking, soft at first, then harder. 3 steady raps against the wall that connected his room to the one next door. Half asleep, Chris knocked back, more out of habit than anything. He figured maybe the person in 411 was bored or drunk, trying to get someone's attention. A minute later, the knocking came again. This time, slower, louder. Chris frowned, pressing his ear to the wall. That's when he heard it. Breathing. Heavy, raspy breathing, like someone was leaning against the wall, waiting for him to respond. "Hey," Chris called out nervously. "Can you keep it down?" The breathing stopped. For a while, the room was silent again. Chris eventually drifted back to sleep, but not for long. At 3:12 a.m., he was woken again. Not by knocking this time, but by the sound of scratching. Long, deliberate scratches running across the shared wall just feet from where he was lying in bed. Goosebumps crawled up his arms. He grabbed the phone and called the front desk, explaining that the guest next door was making weird noises. The clerk promised to check it out. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at Chris's door. The night manager stood outside, looking puzzled. "You said it was coming from the room next door?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, room 411. The manager shook his head. "That room's been locked up for months. No one's staying in there." Chris felt his stomach drop. "I heard someone. Scratching. Breathing." The manager offered to show him. They went together to room 411. The manager slid a key card, opened the door, and flicked on the light. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, dust gathered on the dresser, the air stale like no one had been inside for weeks. But here's the part that still keeps Chris awake at night. On the inside of the wall that connected to his room, at eye level just above the headboard, were marks, dozens of them, deep scratches carved into the wallpaper as if someone had been clawing to get out. Chris didn't stay another night. He packed his bag and left before dawn. He told me that every now and then when he checks into a hotel, he listens carefully to the room next door. And sometimes in the silence, he swears he can hear faint breathing through the wall. And if you've ever been kept awake in a hotel by noises in the room beside you, you might wonder if it's really another guest. Or something else entirely. David was in his early 40s when this happened. He had taken his teenage daughter, Emily, on a short trip to Orlando. They checked into a hotel not far from the theme parks, a mid-range place with colorful carpets and long, echoing hallways. Their room was on the 6th floor, 2 queen beds, nothing unusual. After a long day out, they came back late, ordered pizza, and fell asleep with the TV still on. Sometime after midnight, David woke up. He wasn't sure why at first, maybe a noise in the hallway. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and noticed the faint sound of wheels squeaking, like a cart rolling across the carpet. At first he thought nothing of it. Maybe housekeeping had to handle something late, but then he remembered it was 2 a.m. Housekeeping was long gone by then. He got up, careful not to wake Emily, and peeked through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. A woman in a faded housekeeping uniform was standing right outside his door. She wasn't moving. She wasn't pushing a cart. She was just standing there, facing the peephole directly, as if she knew he was watching. David stumbled back from the door, his pulse racing. He whispered to himself, "What the hell?" He waited a full minute before daring to look again. But when he peered through the peephole the second time, the hallway was empty. No woman, no cart, nothing. David tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. He crawled back into bed, trying not to disturb Emily, and eventually drifted off again. But around 3:30, he woke a second time. This time, it wasn't the sound of wheels. It was the sound of a key card sliding into the door. David bolted upright as the handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. He jumped to his feet and shouted, "This room's occupied!" The noise stopped. The hallway went silent again. Heart pounding, David called the front desk and demanded to know why housekeeping was trying to enter his room in the middle of the night. The clerk on duty sounded confused. "Sir, we don't have housekeeping working right now. They leave at 10 p.m. David insisted that someone had tried to open his door. After a pause, the clerk admitted something unsettling. "You're not the first person to say that. Some guests report seeing one of our old staff, a housekeeper who passed away a few years back." David's voice shook as he asked, "Passed away?" The clerk lowered his voice. "She died here, on the 6th floor. Heart attack in one of the rooms. Some people say she still makes her rounds at night." David didn't sleep again. He sat awake in the chair by the window, watching the door until sunrise. When Emily woke, he told her they were checking out early. He didn't explain why. To this day, he refuses to stay on the 6th floor of any hotel, and every time he hears the squeak of a cleaning cart, he feels a chill crawl up his spine. Hotels are supposed to be about comfort, about rest, but sometimes the staff that once worked there never really leave. Aaron was 29 when it happened. He had been driving cross-country and stopped in Albuquerque for the night. The hotel he found wasn't run down, but it wasn't high class either. Just a mid-priced place with long, dimly lit hallways and the faint smell of chlorine drifting up from the pool. He was given room 217. The clerk at the desk, a quiet young guy, slid him the key card without much small talk. Aaron carried his bag upstairs, following the numbers along the hallway. 213, 215, 217. He found his door easily, but as he passed 215, he noticed something odd. Between 215 and 217, there was another door, but it had no number, no peephole, just a plain beige door with a scratched-up handle. It didn't look like a supply closet, too wide for that. It looked exactly like a guest room door, except it wasn't marked. Aaron felt a strange chill but brushed it off. He went into his room, watched TV, and fell asleep. Sometime after midnight, he woke to a sound. A door closing in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps followed, heavy ones moving past his room. He turned over, telling himself it was just another guest, but then he froze. The footsteps stopped, right outside his door. He held his breath, staring at the gap under the door, waiting for a shadow to appear. Nothing. Then came the sound of a key card sliding, not at his door, but at the door next to his. The door without a number. Aaron sat up in bed. He swore he heard the lock click. The door opened with a faint creak, then shut again. Curiosity gnawed at him, but fear kept him in bed. He stared at the wall for what felt like hours, waiting for another sound. Finally, he drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, he stepped into the hallway. The numbered doors looked normal, but when he glanced at the door without a number, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The doorframe was scratched, like it had been pried open dozens of times, and when he leaned closer, he swore he could hear something faint on the other side, breathing. At checkout, Aaron asked casually about the door. "What's in that room between 215 and 217? The clerk went pale. He shook his head. "There's no room there, sir. Just a wall." Aaron insisted he had seen the door, had heard it open in the middle of the night. The clerk's expression hardened. "That area is sealed off. Has been for years." Aaron left without pressing further, but he told me that to this day, he can't stop thinking about it. A sealed-off room hidden behind a door without a number. Something inside it moving at night. Something the hotel didn't want him or anyone to know about. And the scariest thought, if a hotel can hide one room from you, how many others are there that you'll never know about?